Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Joining me is my partner, Andrew Malcolm, the Prince of Twitter, if a prince can be said to have a partner, and of course, the Regent of Red State, which probably also doesn't necessarily work with the partner thing either, but that's okay, because Andrew is such a nice guy that he allows me to come along for the ride at Malcolm on Twitter. Yeah. So, all right, partner and sire.
Yeah. Well, it's good to be back.
Yeah, it's great to be back. The top story, I think, the top media story this week is also just the top story, right? Which is that the lab leak theory, which the CDC, the NIH, the NIAID, and pretty much every mainstream media outlet spent 3 years insisting was nothing more than a conspiracy theory, a tinfoil hat explanation for how COVID originated, turns out to have been the conclusion reached by the Department of Energy and the FBI. The FBI almost 2 years ago came to the conclusion that COVID leaked from the lab. And we are starting to find out also at the same time that Anthony Fauci lied about a study that he commissioned. He claimed he had no connection to this study. He actually commissioned a study to disprove, and I'm using scare quotes here, disprove the lab leak theory in February of 2020, which is just when COVID was arriving on America's shores. Now, Andrew, I have a theory about this, as you might imagine, and I'm sure that I'm going to get the tinfoil hat rating on this from mainstream media outlets. But what the hell were they doing trying to disprove a theory at the very beginning of this thing?
That wasn't widely known then. What's your theory?
Well,
I'm intrigued.
My theory on this, and wait a minute, I have to get that background shot, where there's yarn all over the place, because I'm sure people are going to accuse me of this, but just the same. The reason why they were trying to get out ahead of this is because Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci, but primarily Francis Collins, had made the decision to restart funding for gain-of-function research in December 2017. There had been a 3-year moratorium on this up to that point in time, based in large part because bioscientists working in the field said it's too dangerous. You're going to create a pandemic out of this at some point because the lab safety protocols fail from time to time, and we have outbreaks that come out of labs. And so in the Obama administration, I'll give credit to the Obama administration here. They looked at this report from the Cambridge Working Group and they said, maybe we should stop doing the funding for this. Well, 3 years later, Francis Collins restarts it in December of 2017 over the objection from the same scientists who again predicted at the time, you're going to create a pandemic. One day you're going to end up creating something that gets out of the lab and it's going to spread all over the world. 23 months later, well, let me back up. Francis Collins removes the moratorium. Anthony Fauci starts sending grant money to EcoHealth Alliance and who knows who else that directly funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology in this gain-of-function research work. A year later, the State Department comes back to everybody and says this Wuhan Institute of Virology has all sorts of problems with its level 4 biosafety protocols. They're not following them. They're not trained for it. They don't have enough personnel. And we really need to take a step back and, rethink our partnership in these things. This is all on the record, by the way. This is all on the record prior to February 2020. None of this was secret. It was actually public record. They ignore it. They keep funding it. They don't do anything about it. And in less than 2 years after they lift the moratorium, of course, in November of 2019, all of a sudden, scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology got sick and COVID-19 spread around the world after epicentering in Wuhan. 3 months after that, you've got Fauci, who's trying to get ahead of this by saying, oh, I've got a study that says it couldn't have been a lab leak. Now,
what a sneak.
My theory on this, I actually don't think it's a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory at all, is that Fauci knew that if it came out that this was a lab leak, then everybody would point the finger back at Collins and back at Fauci for conducting gain-of-function research over the objections of scientists who understood what the dangers were. Now, government officials covering shit up doesn't surprise me, but the national media is supposed to ask these questions, and instead the national media went along with this, and for 3 years treated this as a nut job conspiracy theory, even while the FBI had already concluded that was the likeliest explanation.
Amazing. Now, who's this Francis guy?
Francis Collins. You've seen him. He's about the same age as Fauci, I think. He was the director of the National Institutes of Health. Oh. And you would see Collins on stage with Fauci, sometimes in place of Fauci, sometimes Fauci was in place of him. Technically speaking, Collins was Fauci's boss. I don't know if it really worked that way, but organizationally, Collins was at the top of the chain at NIH.
You know, when it first came out, I didn't know about the study, but when it first came out, it seemed pretty credible to me. I mean, I never bought into the conspiracy crap because it seems like that would be the most likely thing. The people playing around with it. And my question was, why are they playing around with this stuff? So if Obama's administration stopped it, did Trump allow it?
Well, I don't think Trump knew about it. I mean, you're talking about a guy who's famously kind of disengaged from the process, right? And I mean, I don't even think that necessarily Obama was engaged in this until the working group, spoke up and said this, and I don't know if that Obama made that decision on his own. Excuse me, it may have been somebody, may have been the, Health and Human Services Secretary who looked at this and said, we don't want this. The last thing we want is to be blamed for a global pandemic. So maybe we should listen to these guys. All I can say is that in Obama's administration, that warning was heeded, and in Trump's administration, it was not, and likely because he just assumed that these guys knew what they were doing.
Yeah. What is the rationale behind gain of function?
All right. This is going to sound stupid because it pretty much is. And this is what the Cambridge Working Group kind of said as well. The purpose of gain of function research is to try to get ahead of a mutation in a virus that isn't uptaking with human populations yet, so that you can develop some sort of vaccine or defense against it when it does cross over. The problem is, especially with this one, is that it wasn't crossing over, and so they spliced a specific genetic sequence in it to force it to cross over, so they can make it work. I mean, they were playing around with this thing for a while, and
so what would the defense be? A vaccine?
Yeah, a vaccine, therapeutics, that type of thing, and
unintended consequences.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is classic mad scientist type of stuff, right? And the Cambridge Working Group said the same thing. They said there's nothing that you get out of gain of function research that's worth the risk. You can get similar results with, obviously more effort put into other directions. This is a shortcut you shouldn't take. And they were proven very, 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 very much.
All the people who died and suffered because of it.
Yes. And this is what they were trying to avoid. This is what Fauci and Collins and the other people in that medical establishment, not everybody in the medical establishment, but I mean, that's what Fauci and Collins were trying to avoid, was accountability for this. Dr. Robert Redfield, who was the director of the CDC until I think just after Biden took office, when he left, he said, and even before he left, but when he left, he was telling reporters, the lab leak is probably what happened. That's what I believe happened, and it's because they were doing gain of function research in that laboratory, and was trying to warn people, we need to stop doing this type of stuff. And he got shouted down as a Trumpian toady over it, even though Redfield wasn't really a Trump guy. I mean, Redfield was also around forever in the medical, government medical bureaucracy.
Well, once again, the constitutionally protected media watchdogs are asleep at the switch.
Yeah, well, that brings us to something that you talked about today. And I thought that this is this was a good run up to something that I think is an interesting trend. And you talked about it today on Twitter, which was the death of, or the near death. It's not dead yet, but the near death of the daily, right? The daily, what we've been kind of jokingly referring to as the dead tree edition of newspapers that shows up on your doorstep.
Yeah.
For all sorts of uses. We say fish wrap. That's back in the days of H salt fish and chips.
My family used it to on the bottom of parakeet cage. Yes.
Oh, that's another fine use for it. I personally like using it for kindling. For my fireplace. A couple of people who responded to your tweet said that they use it for their charcoal grills, all of which is true. But there was more value to it than that.
Yeah, no, it's a long story, but I'll try to keep it shorter. Print newspapers got very arrogant for a long period of time because they were mainly monopolies in big cities. And they didn't advance. They were late to the internet. They were late to all sorts of things. And they were very cocky and confident in the superiority of their news business. Not in response to readers, but because they were telling readers what was important. I had an editor a print editor in a meeting where I was reporting on the top of the ticket blog when I was running that at the LA Times.
Right.
And he said, "Malcolm, you mean to say you would actually publish a story because you think people would want to read it?" And I said, "You bet your sweet ass, John. How's the Sunday circulation going?" Because they printed stuff for two reasons. The secret reason was to show that they worked that day, that the reporter at City Hall covered some meaningless story, wrote it up, the editor, not the editor, but a copy editor edited it, and they published it. And people going through the paper the next day, there might have been 5 or 6 people who actually read it. Most of them would turn to that page and go, "Oh, a city council staffer said such and such. Who cares?" And the other reason was because they were acting like pharmacists in their white coat, their journalist white coat, handing out the news of the day every morning, and people lined up to get it.
Yep.
So did I. So did my family. My parents for generations, my family. My grandfather got the Telegraph in Toronto, which is now also dead. And they were very comfortable and as a monopoly and slow to change. All of a sudden, the internet came along, 1 million sources of information and news for people, most of them free, most of them aimed to please readers, to interest readers in clicking on them, to get the clicks that produce the revenue. So they were, as we were doing on top of the ticket, with headlines that intrigued people to click, stories that were fun, as opposed to stories that you had to read or that they felt you should read. Well, people aren't into that anymore, especially when there's an alternative, an interesting alternative that's constantly changing and updating and fighting and fun. And then you look at the business model. Okay, so you cut a tree down in Canada, you chip it in the tiny, minute flecks. You make it into paper, into newsprint. You put it on a ship or a train. It weighs like 2.5 tons. And you put it on a ship or a train. You bring it into the city, which isn't the easiest thing in the world. You put it on a truck. You haul it to a printing plant. You roll it off. You have these multi-million-dollar presses that are very complex, complicated. You feed the paper into the press. You print it. Right nowadays in Los Angeles, the news you get on Thursday morning was the news at 6 p.m. Wednesday night on television.
Yeah.
Well, who wants that old? But you print it up anyway. You put it on other trucks. You take it out to the suburbs, to hubs. individuals who are getting pennies for each paper they deliver pick it up in their old Toyota and they drive it around, and most of the time they get to every house. And you pay for that. Well, people that are looking at this just got online and clicked. That's it. And there was no cost to them to get to our conversation. You just can't support that business model. Advertisers have been fleeing. And that's when the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal was first, but the New York Times has figured it out on a larger scale of monetizing the internet. Now they have something like 10 million online subscribers. And look, we can disagree, and we usually do every week, on the coverage that they give. But our democracy needs a functioning, honest, I emphasize honest, media that will report a common set of facts, not narratives, so that we can all learn from them, debate it, and what have you. Now, people are left with picking what narrative they want to follow. May or may not be true. You have the President of the United States saying the economy is strong as hell. And then you have 10, 18,000 people getting laid off at different large firms.
Politicians have lied. So
no, they always lie, but not so blatantly. You'd have to catch them at it. Right. Biden comes out and it's just whole cloth made up, and nobody blows the whistle, or very few blow the whistle. And none in the mainstream media in Washington, because they don't want to risk their access to a guy that's not always telling them the truth.
Well, and I would also add, right, that the media would call them out. And they would call them out fairly equally, or at least it seems so, but it has hardly been the case. There were tens of thousands of fact checks against Donald Trump in the mainstream media. There's very, very few that will do it.
Exactly. And that goes back a ways. When Reagan came in, and then George H.W. Bush, the media suddenly discovered the homeless problem again.
Yeah, right.
And then when Clinton comes in, it goes away. It's
Biden came in.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot of the bias that we talk about and that we see so blatantly in the narratives. There's a pre-bias that comes before, which is, what are you going to cover in the first place? And remember the 2 years where nobody covered Hunter's laptop? Wow, that's Russian disinformation. Who said that? There's another conspiracy theory that was phony. So it's disappointing. It's devastating to the what's the word? To the common communications that our democracy is supposed to have. And so you have to get it piecemeal. And I don't think people have realized the responsibility that's put on them because of the internet to find news sources, different sources, trustworthy sources to follow regularly. They just find one that's entertaining or interesting or agrees with them, and they follow it, and they don't triangulate to get what's really true.
It's interesting too when we talk about the dead tree versions, right, and how they were used. I was fortunate. A lot of people in America in the last 70, 80 years, right, even prior to the internet thing, most of the people lived in a place where there was only one newspaper.
Right.
In Los Angeles, when I was growing up, there was at least 3 majors.
Yeah.
Okay. And you could, in the greater Los Angeles area, I should say, one was the Santa Ana Register, which is the one that we normally would subscribe to. It's now the Orange County Register, and it's always been a sort of a conservative libertarian bent at the OC Register, Santa Ana Register. Their main competitor was Los Angeles Times, and then there was also the Los Angeles Herald Examiner, which was sort of a little bit more wilder and woollier, right? Herald
Yeah.
Examiner was a little bit, I wouldn't call it a tabloid, but it was a little bit more tabloidy. Plus there were more localized um, newspapers. I'm trying to remember. I think it was there was one in Long Beach. There was another in Newport Beach, both of which were good newspapers, actually. And if you had an opportunity to pick them up and read, you realize they were good newspapers. But it kind of leads me back to what I think we're seeing now, and this came up because there was a little kerfuffle when I think it was NewJersey.com or NJ.com laid off their White House correspondent. And I could be wrong. It might have been a different New Jersey newspaper, but it was definitely a New Jersey newspaper, major New Jersey newspaper, laid off their White House correspondent. And Chris Christie and Phil Murphy both said it was horrible. They're going to underserve New Jersey residents, but truly, New Jersey residents who want to see what's going on in Congress, because I think actually it wasn't a White House correspondent, I think it was a congressional correspondent. There's all sorts of different ways that you can look that stuff up.
Yeah.
I think what newspapers are shifting to and have been shifting to, and I'm talking about just the newspapers now, is hyperlocal coverage, because that's the only unique news commodity that they can manage, right? Is local news. Now, the New York Times, Washington Post, they have national scope. Los Angeles Times has national scope. But the Press Telegram is, I think it was the Long Beach Press Telegram is what I'm thinking. The Press Telegram, the Pilot in Newport, the Daily Pilot in Newport Beach, they were hyper local. They might pick up some wire service stuff on national stuff, but even back then in the 70s and 80s, when I was reading them more regularly, they were really all about what was going on locally, because they understood that was their niche.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think you're going to see all these paper dailies going back to being hyper local, because that's the only way that they're going to be able to survive. They're going to report on local news and leave the national news to the internet stuff, right?
Yeah.
All the stuff that you just got done saying.
There was great resistance to going more national on the New York Times, which is now that's their bread and butter.
Right.
Back in the 80s, and their national edition was way too much New York. They thought, oh, well, everybody wants to know about New York. No, not at all. Very few people care about the New York Yankees outside of New York. And they finally got a guy in there who was the former national news editor, who made the national edition into a national edition. And it was greatly reduced, the New York news. And I don't see the New York Times newspaper anymore. I haven't for years. So I know they do pay attention to some local news, but not like those that made it their bread and butter.
Right.
And to be honest, I subscribe online to the digital New York Times. Not because I don't care about anything in New York City. I do it for the foreign news coverage, which has no narrative. It's very professional, very factual, and especially on Ukraine. I mean, they've got photographers in Bakhmut. They've got reporters in the trenches, so you're getting real stuff. You're not getting ABC's shortened version of what somebody said in a Russian blog. So, that would be the least local news, the foreign news. But they're really very good at it, and there is no narrative. It's more factual on the foreign staff. I was on the foreign staff, so I know how they run it. But it's sad. It really is, and it could long term. It's disastrous, and I don't know. There will be some way that America and its industries work it out, but I can't imagine at the moment what it would be.
Well, yeah, I don't know either. I think that the answer is diversification.
Yeah.
Local media needs to be local. National media can focus on national, right? And all of them should be doing a better job than they are.
Yeah, right. And not buying into the narrative that Hunter's laptop is Russian disinformation, that it's a tinfoil hat thing on the Wuhan lab, all that kind of crap. If you do your own legwork, you'd find out that there's some real credibility to it. And it took the New York Times, the Washington Post 2 years to do it. And when they did it, they sort of backed into it because they were trying to cover their butts.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
and again, I think that this is all a part of the sort of the credibility demolition of the media, and this thing with Fauci and the lab leak.
That's insidious.
The other parts of this is just it's propaganda. And there was another report today too that Fox News had, that they have a source within CNN. They claim, right? I mean, this is Fox, and CNN's a competitor, so I don't think they'd make this up, but I don't know what the quality of the source was either. It's like, oh, this guy cleans offices at night at CNN.
Yeah, right.
I mean, anonymous sourcing, you got to be careful with anonymous sourcing.
You got to be very careful, yeah.
But they claim that their anonymous source within CNN says that Jeff Zucker told people within CNN that he did not want them investigating the lab leak theory because it was a narrative that was designed to boost Trump, or would boost Trump. It was a narrative that would boost Trump. And this is, early in the pandemic in 2020. And Zucker didn't want to give any news that might boost Trump's standing.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, that's just corrupt. It's corrupt. It's not even.
It is. It's totally corrupt. Totally corrupt and biased. And there has always been some fudging. If you were writing about a charity in New York City that was a favorite of the publisher, you're not going to investigate them and talk about groping at their banquet. But that was small scale stuff that didn't matter. But now that's happening on a big scale. Well, we wouldn't want to say that. So let's craft the narrative that it had something to do with nefarious Trump activities.
Right.
And that way, well, and the plus to that is that Trump gets more clicks. I mean, that's a given.
Yeah.
He's a showman. And so they can argue it. Well, people want to read it. But it's just, I mean, probably nobody cares, but I spent 55 years in the media, and to see it get covered with this green scum like such stagnant pond, it's very disheartening. It's very disheartening.
All right. No, we're almost out of time. I did want to get to your.
Imagine that.
Did want to get to your stuff today over at redstate.com. I'm going to just mention the one thing. I want to talk about the other. I'm just going to mention your VIP column, which is Biden's ongoing second-term indecision creates a real GOP opening, hurts Dems. Go over and read that. Won't get into it today, but go over, make sure you read that. I do want to get into your Malcolm on the Right topic, though, because this is hilarious. It has a tie-in to the news this week. Americans are changing U.S. politics with their U-Haul trailers. And I mean, I saw a couple of days ago where California has run out of U-Hauls.
Yes.
I mean, is that what you're picking up on here? Is that the fact that California?
Well, it's not just California, but Americans are moving. Now, we're a restless people. There's a lot of space to move to and from, and that people self-selected themselves who wanted to wander, who wanted to have adventure and come to America. This is going back a couple hundred years. So we've always moved around, and for a long time it was to the west. Okay, and the geographic center of American population has been creeping across Missouri. Every 10 years, it would be a little bit further west. Now it's going south. And the reason is more red states in the South for one reason.
Right.
And it's not that people are seeking Republicans, they're seeking the economic climate and conditions and laws that Republicans favor. No income tax in Texas, Florida, Tennessee, lower taxes in other places, in red state places. Their first thought is not how can we get more money to spend on this new idea. Their first thought is how can we cut waste to have more money to put into new ideas. And it's a totally different philosophy. And I don't say that everybody who rents a U-Haul is thinking, where can I go for more hospitable politics? But they're going for a better life. And that and the attention to crime is happening in red states. And California, for the first time since 1850 statehood, lost a representative in the latest election. So they're now at 54 instead of 55, which is still the largest, but Texas got 2. And that's a sign of the population growth in Texas where you live. And they got another extra member because you're there.
Right.
And they said, we have to influence Morrissey.
Yeah. Morrissey's got to weigh in on this. That's right.
That's right. Morrissey says we need more representatives. But it's interesting. It was interesting to me, it still is, that Americans are consciously making decisions. Now, they always have. I mean, the blacks went north in the big migrant movement because of the jobs in the big cities, and now they're gone. The jobs
right.
in the big industrial plants and so on. So there's been constant movement, but now the main movement is south. And to me, that was really very interesting. And it adds political strength to Republicans, to red states. And I think Democrats ignore it at their peril. I mean, the governor in Florida, he won by 19 points in an era that is so hyper partisan. So he got a lot of Democrat votes in Florida. So that kind of stuff.
He was in California last week talking to Californians, telling them that Gavin Newsom's full of baloney. Euphemism here. And that the reason why people are moving to Florida is because it is better there. And that was payback for DeSantis going out to Florida and claiming that, oh no, California is where it's at, people.
No, Newsom. You mean Newsom going to Florida?
Newsom going to Florida. I'm sorry, Newsom going to Florida, claiming, oh, California is where it's at. No, it's where it was at. And people have figured that out.
Yeah, I mean, the crime, the homelessness, the expensive way of living is
the regulatory environment, the top-down authoritarianism in California. It's absolutely unsustainable, and everybody understands that. And getting back, we'll just tie this up with a bow with media bias. Whenever you see this being discussed, right, the big exodus out of California, it's always the same thing. The media always says the same thing. Well, there's a housing crisis going on.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a housing crisis, and that adds to the issue. It isn't the housing crisis, though. It's a government crisis. It is a governance crisis, and the housing crisis is only one small part of that.
Well, when you continually and repeatedly elect supermajorities, I don't care what the party is. It could be the Mickey Mouse Party. Supermajorities create arrogance in power, and they do silly things. They haven't built new reservoirs. On the other hand, by golly, they banned plastic straws and little plastic shampoo bottles in hotels. So they're right on top of the important things.
Yep. Indeed. All right. Well, we're just about wrapping up here. It's about the time that we get to the jokes of the week. I don't know if you've got any.
No, I got some. Yeah, I got. These are all old now.
Okay.
Jay Leno, he said the price of gas near my house went up to $4.50 today. And that was while I was pumping. It started at $3.85. Just as an anecdote, I don't know, 3 weeks ago, maybe, I was driving by the Exxon station locally, And those lighted signs that have the state law says you got to tell what the price is, and it said 284, 285, 286. As I was watching 287, they were adjusting it, and it went up to it went from 274 to 289 while I was watching it. Now it's over 3. But anyway, Conan said the Oscar show got panned, but one highlight was a presentation by 94, he's passed now, but 94-year-old Kirk Douglas. When the telecast began, he was only 89.
Yeah.
And finally, Conan O'Brien said The Artist movie won 5 Oscars. That works out to 1 Oscar for every person who saw that movie.
I still haven't seen that movie. I heard it was good. It's an art film, but I still have that. That's actually,
Yeah,
I guess that's kind of a joke, but I mean, it really is. It's an art film that just didn't have broad appeal. I'll just say, all right, I got one joke for you.
Okay.
Top 3 situations that require witnesses. Number 1, crimes. Number 2, accidents. Number 3, marriages.
Oh, that makes me cough. That was funny.
And we don't tell our wives these jokes, by the way. We just we make sure. Oh, honey, the show ended at exactly 30 minutes, so you don't want to go.
You don't have to listen.
You don't have to listen past that. All right. Andrew Malcolm, the prince of Twitter, the regent of redstate.com, but a married guy just like the rest of us. Well, it's great to have you on. We will talk to you again in 2 weeks because I'll
2 weeks. That's right. Okay. Thanks. See you, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Now that the political infighting is over and the sausage is being made in the House, it's time for Republicans to unite with one cause and fight back against Joe Biden and his radical administration. The GOP has promised to investigate Biden family corruption, the border, big tech censorship collusion, the origins of COVID, the FBI, and intel agencies' attacks on the American people, and more, and it's time to hold them to those promises. Here at Hot Air, we won't let up on holding them accountable. We unapologetically fight back against the radical left and squishy rhinos in Congress who fail the people. We bring you the truth and go to war against Biden's woke communist agenda. But we need your help. By becoming a VIP for hotair.com, you can help us in this battle for our country. Just look at the House Democrats leader, Hakeem Jeffries. He's another divisive radical leftist, and his communist Sesame Street speech proves it. If Republicans don't halt the Biden agenda and conservative media fails to hold them accountable, it could mean the end of our great country. Join us in the fight. Become a Hot Air VIP member or a VIP Gold member today and use the promo code SAVEAMERICA to receive a 40% discount on your membership. Stand with us and fight to save America. We will never give up. And thank you very much.